Recording. Great. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the final set of sessions at this year's Calc. And I'm going to hand straight over to Kevin and Maria. Welcome.
Well, thank you. So I understand that the slides on the website are not the correct ones, and so I'm grabbing a link to
Mhm.
share. But while I'm doing that,
I
Maria, would
will,
you begin to
yeah,
introduce us?
absolutely. Hi, so I'm Maria Planansky and Kevin is hard at work. And we are going to talk to you about procurement and the prison industrial complex, pursuing an ethical purchasing policy in a New York State academic library. So before we get started, um, we're in New York State and we want to just briefly consciously and intentionally recognize, acknowledge, and honor that we conducted this research and designed this presentation on the traditional and ancestral lands of the Onondaga, or the Great Hill people, also known as the Seneca people. And so Alfred, New York, where we are, Allegheny County, and New York State at large are still home to the Seneca people. What we'll be doing today is we're going to give you an overview of our institution and the libraries within our institution. It's kind of interesting. We will then go into prison labor in the United States, take you through our investigation into the library's relationship with prison labor, and then give you our takeaways and hopefully leave you with an opportunity to potentially implement some type of audit of your own. Um, Kevin, were you able to upload? I can't see the.
No, I'm going to share a
Okay.
copy afterwards. I'll have to like
Okay.
download and adjust the settings. The institution isn't letting me share with people outside of Alfred.
Okay. Well, we will get those slides to you. Okay.
Cool. Yeah. So thank you, Maria. So I think kind of important to understanding what we did is to look at a little bit of context around Alfred University Libraries, because we're kind of unique in where our funding comes from. And so that will be an important part of kind of considering how we did our audit and how that impacts what we were able to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So I had said a little bit before that Alfred University in the US is tricky and kind of interesting. And that's because we have Alfred University has a private side and a statutory side or kind of public side called the New York State College of Ceramics. So we're one sort of umbrella institution with New York State College of Ceramics. I'm not sure how much this audience knows about private versus public institutions in the United States, but it's pretty significant. And so it means that we have two buildings and two libraries within the AU libraries. One, Herrick's private, schools, statutory or public. And it means they have separate budgets. One is kind of state budget oriented and one is private budget oriented. And there are different rules, though some overlapping rules. Um, as part of as the New York State College of Ceramics, we are part of the State University of New York, or SUNY Consortia, which is made up of about 64 campuses, and means we both follow SUNY policies and state policies about higher education and purchasing in some ways, in some ways, but also not, because we're also private. So it's kind of messy, but also it also means that we have flexibility in a way that a explicitly public university or institution may not have. So we have preferred sourcing for both sides in a way.
And so to provide a tiny bit more context and a little bit of history, in 2020, the AU Libraries made an action-oriented commitment to anti-racism and anti-oppression that led to the creation of a working group that was kind of a space that we would identify projects to work on, and then identify how we were going to tackle them. About a year later, I was working in Scholl's library and I had gotten there early, so not all of the chairs were down. And so I was just like flipping over chairs, kind of getting things set up for the day, because it felt like a nice thing to do. And one of the chairs had a tag on it that said Corecraft. And I had found out recently that Corecraft was kind of the name brand for New York State's Department of Corrections manufacturing arm. Basically, it meant that that chair had been produced in prison by people that were incarcerated. And so this didn't sit right with me, that we had to kind of purchase some of this furniture. at some point in the past. And so I brought this to the AU Library's Anti-Racism and Anti-Oppression Working Group, and we discussed and tried to figure out what we would want to do about it. We determined that we needed to better understand kind of the scope of the issue so that we could determine what we would want to do. And so Maria and I decided to undertake basically doing an inventory of the library furniture across both the public and private side, the two libraries, to try to determine what connections the furniture that we had in the libraries might have to prison labor. And then we would go from there. So a kind of separate context framing here is it's also important for us to think about what it means when we say prison labor in the United States. So incarcerated laborers in the United States work to do a couple of different things. They work to maintain daily operations within prisons, as well as provide goods and services to the state or to private companies outside of prisons. And we're focusing on the latter here. So average earnings for incarcerated laborers in state-owned correctional businesses, or prison labor within kind of state-run facilities in the United States, ranges on average from 33 cents to $1.44 per hour, with the New York State average being about 62 cents per hour. And not everybody that works in prisons is compensated at all. Important for our framing within kind of the working group and thinking about this from our perspective within the institution is that the prison industrial complex in the United States really disproportionately impacts people of color. There's a wide range of studies and research on this, and it's far more than just like looking at populations, but you can look at those population statistics to see that the incarcerated population of Black Americans is much higher than that of just the population in the country. Many legal scholars also connect prison labor directly to slavery because people are so severely underpaid or not necessarily paid at all. And this kind of often is framed alongside the fact that people are forced or coerced into working. And all of this is legal within the United States based on the 13th Amendment, which did end slavery except for kind of as punishment for a crime is the language that's used. So we're obviously thinking about this within the context of academic institutions and what our relationship is like to prison labor. So we did a little bit of research there and found that many public universities are actually required by state law to buy furniture made by prison labor. Virginia, Wisconsin, Maryland, and New York are a handful of those states that have state-run prison systems that have laws that require universities to purchase from them. In other states, such as California, there is not like a legal requirement, but universities do choose to purchase the furniture. In New York, so the state brand, as I mentioned, is called Corecraft. And not only do incarcerated laborers work for Corecraft to produce furniture, but they also provide hazardous services such as asbestos removal, mold removal, bird feces removal, that kind of thing. And then finally, you have academic institutions that may choose to purchase furniture from private organizations that have connections to the prison industrial complex totally outside of the state, such as Kruger International, also known as KI, which we'll get into a little bit more here in a moment. So we set out to do our inventory within the libraries to look at the public and private libraries and determine what the connection was to prison labor. How we went about this was to do a little bit of fact gathering, which meant that we were going to try to inform our audit by understanding the institutional history around purchasing. So we began by assessing our own procurement policies and considering how they compared with the SUNY procurement policies, because as Maria mentioned, we have a little bit of flexibility and wiggle room there that's a little bit interesting and unique. We gathered information also about the history of renovations within the AU libraries to better understand when purchases, like mass purchases, were made. And then we worked with folks within the AU Libraries Administrative Office, as well as the broader AU Procurement Office to look at files related to furniture purchases. Then, before actually beginning the audit, we tried to identify a strategy, and this is what we came up with and essentially followed. So we separated the buildings by public and private because that had an impact on where funding was coming from and how the purchasing was actually happening. We then categorized the furniture that we would be looking at into patron furniture, office and staff furniture, and shelving, and decided that we would just focus on patron-facing furniture because it was the least complicated and we could kind of understand its origin the best. Um, from there, we created a spreadsheet and then went through, took photos, recorded data about each piece of patron-facing furniture within the library, including manufacturer, location, and type of furniture.
Okay. So we began our audit. We had this strategy, and then we had all of this data. I'm going to kind of walk you through it because I'll show you the charts in a moment. It was a lot. And so our separating public versus private, the two buildings, yes, was strategic. But even within then, there was just so much different type of information. And we needed to organize it so we could understand and really wrap our arms around it. So we had to itemize it. We were equipped with things like I'm laughing just like with memories of flipping over furniture and looking at labels. So we basically took sort of architectural guides to both buildings and went through every single room and came up with furniture categories. So just as some background, I am also in like collection management and technical services. So quite a lot of this was quite literally coming up with the controlled vocabulary for the furniture that we were encountering, as well as the different types of manufacturers associated with it. So equipped with images of every type of furniture, both each unique piece and then sort of the type, like workspace seating or task seating versus soft seating versus tables, that kind of thing. And so we came up with patterns and vocabulary to understand the different types of things that we could categorize, because when you purchase something, you purchase a type of furniture for a specific purpose. So we came up with tables, workspace seating, soft seating, and miscellaneous. One thing that was pretty complex was the manufacturer information. I won't speak for Kevin. I was quite naive coming into this, assuming that all furniture would simply have a company label on it. Not the case. So sometimes there would be a patent number. Sometimes there would be, in some cases, like a union brand. And so we had to take that manufacturer information and do detective work to figure out a list of the companies associated with that. So it was quite a bit of raw data and then data organization and then eventually cleaning the data. And again, just keeping in mind, whenever you touch any point in a data process, you just introduce room for error. So just, have to have that caveat. So what did we find out? This is our very, very intense looking pie chart of all the furniture in both across both libraries. And so the big five, even though there were truly meant like just so many, we can't even fit it all on this chart clearly. The big ones were Kruger International, KI, just this no label, right? It's undetermined. They're so old that we could not figure it out, or the labels, like often the manufacturer would the paper trail would run short. Jasper Chair Company, Corecraft, and Gunlock. So those are the companies. And so this is quite an intense pie chart here. But if you break it down into private and statutory, that's when the patterns emerge. So Herrick, private side, completely the vast, vast majority comes from Kruger International. Okay. And so this makes complete sense to us as employees of the university, because this follows a procurement policy where Kruger International is the go-to source for furniture, and also is really in line with a major renovation that happened about a decade ago, decade and a half ago. So this is completely in line, makes complete sense. Skulls, the statutory side in the library, again, it looks messy, and messy is another way of just saying there's so many companies. And yes, there's that undetermined Kruger International, Jasper Chair. So it falls in line. But really what it speaks to is SUNY, both procurement policy and deaccessioning policy, right? So when there's a state-owned item, to offload a state-owned item or state purchase item in the past, it's been a pretty cumbersome and burdensome thing to, you don't just throw out a chair, even if it's broken with state funds, there's a process for it. That process has been updated in the past, few years or so. And there are different people who interpret policies different ways about offloading and things like that. But that speaks to kind of the mishmash of the different types of furniture. The newest purchases, so for furniture categories, that's soft seating, workspace seating, basically soft seating and workspace seating, these are the most commonly used ways that patrons interact with the library when they choose to go in sort of either a conference room, patron facing, or kind of the living room of the library aesthetic that we go for. Okay. The furniture categories also, you can see again with that bit of the mishmash approach with School's Library, because it did not have a large renovation. You can see the procurement policy applied to a large scale renovation with the KI purchasing, and then the small scale purchasing is more piecemeal. So while we do have policies, we aren't exactly beholden to a preferred vendor, except for those really large renovations sometimes. And that's when things go out to bid and the like. So the question is, and I'll hand it off to Kevin in a minute, all these companies that we found, do they use prison labor? And so Kevin will speak more about this.
And this was a difficult question for us to answer because there's not a lot of transparency around specifically private companies that utilize prison labor. So at Corecraft, we were very easily able to track that back because their website is very clear. There's all kinds of state documentation about it. For private companies that were selling furniture to the libraries, we had to kind of go through and run a check of the company names against different lists that already exist. So I have bolded here Worth Rises because it was by far the most productive spreadsheet that we were able to find. But we also ran our companies against lists from Project of the American Friends Services Committee and the Corporate Accountability Lab. If we found them listed, we followed up on the evidence to verify connection to manufacturing prison labor. But again, just because we didn't see a company's name on the list doesn't mean that there isn't a connection there. We just weren't able to prove it in the amount of time that we had. And so the big one that came up for us was KI or Kruger International. Kruger International operates a subsidiary called Original Equipment Industries, or OEI. And OEI was established specifically with correctional industries in mind. When I say correctional industries, that's defined by the National Correctional Industries Association as a program that utilizes prison labor. OEI advertises in different correctional industries publications, consistently really using similar language. So to figure this out, we followed the money trail, which I'll talk about in a second, but then we also just looked at publications where companies were advertising directly to prisons. And what they say, OEI says, is that they're a leader in bringing equality parts, a dedicated sales team, and turnkey support services that are a step above the rest. Kind of reading between, well, not reading between the lines, but putting this in conjunction with the fact that multiple different departments of corrections are purchasing vast amounts of raw materials from Kruger International, as we found in the Texas Department of Justice public records. We were able to determine that basically, while we aren't sure that OEI actually sells prison-made furniture, what they seem to do, or what they do, is provide corrections industries with all the tools necessary to start their own prison labor systems within the prison industrial complex. And clearly it's being utilized because of the amount of money that the Texas Department of Criminal Justice has spent with Kruger International, over 47 million. I think that stat is from the last time I looked at this, which was actually in 2022. So those numbers have probably gone quite up since then. So KI was obviously a big piece, and then we were also looking at Corecraft. Corecraft is as I mentioned, like the brand name for the Division of Correctional Industries, which is an entity within the New York State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision. That's kind of exactly how Corecraft describes themselves on their website. Basically, what they do is they utilize the labor of incarcerated people to provide services such as asbestos removal and manufacturing goods, like producing furniture. Incarcerated laborers within Corecraft can make as little as 16 cents an hour. And in 2014, they were averaging over $48 million in sales annually. So it's a big moneymaker for the state. And I will hand things back over to Maria here to talk a little bit about audits and thinking about ethical purchasing policies, which is kind of the next step that we did with this information.
Okay, so thanks, Kevin. So for folks here today in the audience, something we've talked to other folks, people at SUNY before, and something that has emerged out of it is, well, one, oftentimes people are horrified, but then they want to apply this to their own institution. SUNY folks, people in Virginia often want to do this. I'm just thinking back to different folks we've spoken to over the years. And so you too can conduct your own audit. And I think one of the ways to think about it, about how to wrap your arms around something like, okay, how is your institution engaging with prison labor, is we started with furniture. There are many avenues you can go, but we are going to focus on furniture. And you need to think about it in three different ways. Focus on your materials, institution-based information, fact-finding, and data analysis. So those are the sort of the three buckets to think about when you try to do something like this. So for materials, we're going to get really down to the basics here. For us, quite literally, we would take a laptop, a shared spreadsheet, a camera or a phone that has the ability to take pictures, and couple that with institutional specific materials like our floor plans. We knew in sort of internal policy about how different furniture is used. Our furniture is intended to be pretty mobile, so we would take pictures both of the furniture pieces themselves and how they were used in the space, because we couldn't always block enough time to, say, cover an entire floor before, say, an event was taking place, or we had to teach a class or something similar. So you have your individual materials and then kind of your institution specific materials in the context about how you interact and how your patrons interact with the building. So that's the material side of things. Then you have to have your sort of investigation materials, right? So that is, I would say they're both materials, but also action oriented. So you need to become familiar with procurement or purchasing at your institution. And that could be within the libraries itself, or you may have to go to a larger department. And so for us, that meant we looked at past invoices within the libraries, also had to go to the ordering history at large within the university. We have policy on our website about our preferred vendors. Those have also changed over the years. So we had to go back and sort of find the trajectory of preferred vendors and how that changed. Okay, so that's the institution-specific procurement information. And then you have to combine that information with your fact-finding. Local and state laws. Virginia's laws are not the same as New York laws. New York purchasing is specific to New York. For regulations, New York has institutional bidding processes. And that's sort of linked to our procurement information as well. We have AU institutional, private side institutional bidding processes. And so they overlap. And then you also have your fact finding that Kevin spoke about, where you look at worth rises, for example. One of the investigations we used, media investigations, and other information that's available. Okay. And then you take all that information and you analyze it. So I spoke about kind of creating our own controlled vocabulary and descriptive language for our data analysis. And it's very clean looking, the different, not the results of all the different companies, but the 4 different categories. You know, it's really, it might look clear, but also like we have things in our libraries that are just like, this is very flippant sounding for the subject matter, but we have, like poofs on the ground, or like I don't know, like very artistic coffee tables, like that kind of thing. And so like trying to fit those within a controlled vocabulary where you're tracking labor, it is complicated. And so you need to devote time to doing that. Your vendor and your company list, that will again take time and require, I would say, a fair amount of investigation into if folks aren't familiar with tracking how businesses and patents are filed, that's something you'll need to devote time to learn. Okay, and it can also companies and LLCs and the like, it can depend also by region, by territory. Okay, so you take your data and you have this information, then you have to apply it. So again, the existing information that's out there, CoreCraft, for example, unlike KI, CoreCraft says exactly what it is. The information is right there on its site. It's right there in state law. This is what CoreCraft is. Okay, so that is existing information. There's laws, regulations about it. But then the media advocacy work and then our own internal work, that is also part of it, your investigation about checking your company list and also going in, I would say not non-traditional ways, but like doing true investigative work, like looking at places where these companies approach potential consumers, their customers. Okay. So then there's ethical purchasing. So taking that audit, then like what do you do once you find out that information? So Kevin will speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah, and so here's kind of what we did, and I think that this is a space that you all can kind of think about other applications for like an audit or thinking about an ethical purchasing policy. If prison labor doesn't feel like a perfect fit for your institution, this may be something that you want to think about with like other ways that your library is spending money. But so what we did was that we brought this research back to the working group, and the working group put together an ethical purchasing policy guideline kind of draft for the libraries, proposed it, and we were lucky enough that our administration was eager to adopt it. And so we did this, and it includes language about being conscious of labor practices and inclusivity, buying locally, following accessibility guidelines, and taking into account things like environmental impact. Right, this is mostly for us in this presentation focused on that first piece of labor practices, prison labor, like not satisfying the labor practices requirement of an ethical purchasing policy, or the one that we proposed. And so what this led to was for us to cease purchasing from KI entirely, and led us to developing a stronger relationship with another vendor. In this case, we're going with Solder International. And having done this, we sought to expand this to the university. So we took our research and what we decided on doing within the libraries and brought that to the university level to see if we could make some broader changes.
So I know we only have a few minutes left, so I'll quickly highlight things that we've worked on since this information has come to light. So New York State SUNY campuses and the overall SUNY University Faculty Senate has passed resolutions or initiated resolutions